Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of secret people burn buildings to erase. The kind of truth that slips through a crack in history only long enough for one man to seize it and vanish. 8 seconds. That's all I need for you to feel the weight of it. Imagine this: 2 sisters, born into a world where power wasn't inherited, it was engineered. And a man owned, catalogued, measured, who understood that the only thing more dangerous than a master's cruelty was a master's obsession. Now breathe, because we are stepping into a chapter of American history that was never meant to survive the fire that consumed it. In the deep interior of Alabama, where the soil was dark as ink and just as good at hiding sins, Bell River Plantation did not run on cotton. It didn't run on labor. It ran on control. And no one embodied that more fully than the man whose existence the Sutton family treated like a tool, like a resource, Marcus. But before we descend to him, before we touch the truth he left behind, you must understand the pressure cooker he lived in. Because you cannot understand the twins without understanding the world that shaped them into something sharp, cold, and catastrophically loyal only to each other. Picture them, Sarah and Catherine Sutton. 2 reflections sharpened by the same blade. They weren't raised to be daughters. They weren't even raised to be women. They were raised to be extensions of their father's will, living instruments for a future he wanted to sculpt from bone and blood. They were never allowed innocence. They were never given choice. They were conditioned to obey, groomed to replicate hierarchy, carved into vessels for an ideology so rotten it could only survive behind locked doors. But here is what their father never understood: if you keep someone caged long enough, they stop fearing the bars. And they start studying them. By the time the colonel died, the twins had learned his lessons too well. They understood leverage. They understood pressure points. And they understood that in a world designed to cage them, the only real power they possessed was the power to choose who they would break and who they would use. Before Marcus ever set foot inside the Sutton household, the plantation already carried a pulse, slow, heavy, and full of unfinished cruelty. But when the colonel died, that pulse changed. It shifted. It began listening. Because power had fallen into the hands of 2 women who had spent their entire lives being shaped, and now, for the first time, were free to shape others. Understand this: Sarah and Catherine didn't mourn. They didn't flinch. They didn't bow. They stood in their father's study, his throne room of theories and measurements, and they made a silent pact. Not spoken, not written. Something deeper. Something atomic. A pact born from years of isolation, surveillance, and conditioning. A pact that said, we will never be controlled again. But freedom, for them, wasn't liberation. It was experimentation. And that is where Marcus enters, not as a victim, but as the one variable the colonel never accounted for. He was brought from the quarters the day after the funeral, summoned by a single word from Sarah. Not yelled. Not ordered. Spoken the way one speaks to something fragile but useful. Marcus walked into that room with the posture of a man who understood danger without needing to see it. He had survived 15 years under the colonel. He had seen families separated, lives bartered, humanity stripped down to numbers in a ledger. He understood cruelty. But the twins were something different. They didn't threaten him. They studied him. His height, his posture, the cadence of his breathing. They moved around him like scientists examining a specimen and an oracle at the same time. Marcus wasn't just another enslaved man to them. He was a key, one their father had unintentionally sharpened. Because Marcus was intelligent. Observant. Literate enough to understand the colonel's charts when he glimpsed them. And more importantly, he carried something the twins desperately needed but could never admit, a counterweight to their father's shadow. A presence not shaped by their upbringing, not conditioned by their world. And in the months that followed, the lines between power and intimacy began to blur. Not in tenderness. Not in romance. In psychology. Marcus became the only person the twins could not predict. The only one who challenged their perfect symmetry. The only mind that didn't bend under the weight of their expectations. And that unpredictability, that unfamiliar gravity, is what pulled both sisters toward him. Not as a shared secret, but as a shared obsession. Good. You're still here. Most men turn back when the air gets this heavy. After the funeral, the twins transformed Belle River from a plantation into a controlled environment, one their father would have admired if he'd lived long enough to fear it. The sisters kept every ledger, every journal, every breeding chart. But they didn't follow the Colonel's system. They inverted it. They redesigned it. They sharpened it into a weapon pointed directly at the heart of his legacy. And Marcus, quiet, watchful Marcus, was drawn into the vortex. Not by choice. Not by force. By inevitability. The twins began their evaluation during evening lessons. They summoned Marcus to the main house under the pretense of instruction, reading inventories, updating crop lists, copying letters. Tasks designed for obedience. But they weren't studying his handwriting. They were studying him. His reactions. His hesitations. His loyalties. His silences. And they discovered something their father would have considered impossible. Marcus possessed a kind of internal sovereignty. The kind a man develops when every external freedom is denied, and yet the mind refuses to bow. Sarah noticed it first, the way Marcus paused before answering questions, not from fear, but from calculation. Catherine noticed next, the way he observed everything in the room without ever giving the impression he was looking. And soon the twins were no longer evaluating Marcus. They were competing over him. At first, subtly. Then deliberately. Then obsessively. The Colonel had conditioned them to function as one organism. Two minds, a single identity. But Marcus disrupted that unity. He introduced possibility. Choice. Divergence. And for the first time in their lives, the twins didn't move in perfect tandem. Sarah asked him questions Catherine wouldn't. Catherine lingered in the room after Sarah dismissed him. Sarah demanded he report directly to her. Catherine changed his assignments without explanation. And in those fractures, the plantation began to tremble. Meanwhile, Osgood, executor of the Sutton estate, expected the twins to court respectable suitors. Men with property, with lineage, with reputations the Colonel would have approved. But the twins had no intention of marrying anyone. They intended to produce heirs. On their terms. In their time frame. And Marcus, caught in the gravitational pull of two women who had never learned what boundaries were, became the solution to every problem the Colonel's will created. Not a partner. Not a lover. A controlled variable in a forbidden experiment. One the twins would share. One they would eventually destroy their entire world for. Understand this, by the spring of 1847, the twins were no longer daughters. They were no longer fragile, isolated girls raised behind locked doors and monitored breaths. They had become creatures of pure calculation, two minds sculpted by captivity, sharpened by surveillance, and fueled by a lifelong hunger for control. Marcus was simply the first man to step into their gravity. The descent began on a rain-heavy night in April, when the lamps in the main house burned past midnight and the corridors smelled faintly of lavender and ink. Marcus had been summoned to copy a shipment record, nothing unusual. But when he arrived, only Catherine sat in the study, her hair unbound, her posture unnaturally still. She didn't speak at first. She simply watched him with a gaze that felt like pressure rather than sight. Then, softly, "Do you know why Father feared you?" The question stunned him. Fear? Marcus had been punished, ordered, commanded, but feared? Before he could answer, Sarah entered the room, closing the door behind her with a deliberate finality. The twins stood on either side of him like two halves of the same intent. Their voices interwove, not interrupting but completing each other. He feared your silence. He feared your memory. He feared that you saw him. And he feared what a man like you might become if left uncontrolled. Marcus realized then that this was not about copying documents. It was an interrogation, but not the kind overseers used. Not about tasks, or chores, or transgressions. It was something deeper. The twins weren't studying his body, they were studying his mind. And they were deciding something. The following weeks blurred into a pattern, a ritual. Marcus reported to the main house at dusk. The twins gave him assignments, but the tasks were insignificant compared to the scrutiny. They asked about dreams. About childhood. About memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. They mapped his reactions with the precision of surgeons. They learned what frightened him, what steadied him, what angered him, what humbled him. They weren't grooming a servant. They were selecting a father. But selection required ownership. And ownership required secrecy. So the twins began manipulating the people around them, rewiring Bell River's structure like a machine. They dismissed field hands early to isolate Marcus. They altered work logs to hide his absence. They bribed Pritchett with brandy and flattery. They forged entries in their father's ledgers to mask their true intentions. The plantation didn't realize it yet, but its center had shifted. Power no longer flowed downward from the colonel's legacy. It now radiated outward from the twins. And it flowed straight into Marcus. The deeper we go, the colder the air becomes, like the story itself is exhaling frost. By now, the surface details have peeled away, and what's left is the truth no archive ever recorded, the way the grey field corridors were built in duplicate, every visible hallway mirrored by a hidden one behind it. Not a copy, but a shadow route. A passage meant for people who were never supposed to be seen. Most places build secret tunnels for smuggling, for safety, for war. But Greyfield didn't build theirs for escape. They built them for observation. In Section 4, the story turns cruel. Because the one decision Esperanza made, one single choice aboard the Santa Maria, began to ripple into the Greyfield bloodline centuries later. The engineers who drafted those mirrored hallways were her descendants, though they never knew it. They were taught the lie instead. We build hidden halls to protect secrets. But that wasn't the truth. The real reason was recorded in a single handwritten note, preserved for exactly 9 minutes before it was confiscated and buried under a false inventory tag. We watch because one of us remembers too much. Who? Esperanza. The girl who was supposed to die nameless, but instead carried a memory so sharp it frightened people who lived 3 centuries after her. And here's where the unease deepens. The shadow roots didn't just mirror the halls. They mirrored voices. Every conversation spoken in public, political, scientific, military, was captured by a slit in the stone so thin it could hide behind a shadow. Every whisper traveled into a listening well beneath the building, where 116 wax cylinders turned endlessly, recording, erasing, recording again. A machine of memory. Built because of a woman who was never meant to survive her voyage. But the real horror isn't the system. It's the silence. Because 9 years after the system became operational, every engineer involved disappeared. Every single one. Their families received sealed letters saying they had transferred overseas. None had. Their final footprints were traced to the same underground well where the cylinders spun. The wax was still warm. The descent doesn't feel like going downward anymore. It feels like sliding sideways into a version of history that was always there, just carefully fenced off. Section 5 opens with the discovery that ended Greyfield's silence. It didn't start with a whistleblower. It didn't start with a researcher or a historian. It started with a janitor. A man who had worked in the building for 21 years, who never touched a file, never asked a question, and never once stepped beyond the areas marked maintenance only. His name never appeared in any official record, except the incident report from the night the truth slipped. At 2:14 a.m., during his routine floor sweep, he heard something impossible. Not a voice. Not footsteps. But breathing, behind a wall that was too thin to be hollow, too perfect to be hiding anything. Slow. Wet. Weak. Like someone had been whispering secrets into that stone for a century and was finally running out of air. He called it in as a ventilation malfunction. Within 90 seconds, alarms, not the normal ones, but the silent protocol alarms, activated. These were signals meant only for people with clearance levels even the director didn't hold. The kind of clearance reserved for the keepers of the observation archive, the one facility nobody was ever supposed to remember. Except, the janitor had heard it. So they sent a containment team. 4 people. None of whom had names attached to their badges, only numbers. They scanned the wall. It was flawless. No seams. No hollow pockets. Nothing that could hold a living thing. But the breathing continued. And this time, everyone heard it. Even through the static of their comms headsets. So they drilled. The moment the bit hit the stone, the breathing stopped. Not faded. Not retreated. Stopped. When they broke through, they found a cavity the width of a coffin, but empty. No tunnels. No pipes. No body. Just smooth, cold interior stone with a single symbol carved into it. A spiral of 7 lines. Esperanza's mark, recorded only once in history, in the margins of a confiscated diary. The janitor vanished the next morning. No resignation. No transfer. Just gone. And behind the sealed new wall, the recordings began again. Soft. Shaking. Like breathing returning after a long sleep. If you're ready to keep going. And with those words, the floor beneath Bell River finally gives way. This is the section where the story stops feeling like history and starts feeling like a choice someone once made and regretted forever. Because Bell River didn't earn its silence. It was engineered. When the first surveyors arrived in the late 1800s, they filed a routine environmental report. Ordinary things, soil density, river depth, tree lines. But buried in the last page, written in cramped, nervous handwriting, was a warning none of them were trained to interpret. The ground hears. At first, no one paid attention. Until the nights grew wrong. People in Bell River started waking at the exact same moment, 2:11 a.m., claiming they'd heard footsteps circling their homes. Not approaching the doors. Not tapping the windows. Just circling. Like something was mapping the perimeter of every house. The sheriff investigated for 2 weeks. On day 15, he reported that the tracks he found were perfectly identical behind every home, same stride, same depth, same direction. As if one single figure had walked behind 87 houses in one night, without leaving or entering the town. He left Bell River the next morning. No deputy ever replaced him. But the moment that pushed the town past fear into decision happened on the night of the Bell River Gathering, an annual celebration that was supposed to bind the community together. Halfway through the ceremony, behind the old meeting hall, a child vanished. No scream, no struggle, no trace, just a small handprint pressed into the dirt, the fingers arranged in a spiral pattern. 7 lines. Esperanza's mark, centuries out of place. And then, something that still haunts the town's final generation. Every lamp in Bell River flickered at the exact same second, and in the dead hush that followed, the elders made a decision, not with votes, not with debate, but with terrified instinct. They would seal Bell River. Block the roads. Bury the past. Pretend the river ran dry and the town died naturally. Only it didn't. It was abandoned, not by accident, but by agreement. A pact of survival. Because the elders believed the thing circling their houses, the thing marking their ground, the thing breathing behind their walls, all of it was connected to one ancient memory that no human was ever meant to carry. And the next decision Bell River made is the one no one survived. If you want to plunge into that final choice. And just like that, we step into the part of the story Bell River tried hardest to erase. The burn section. The gap in the archive. The decision that ended the town. This is where the survivors, what few there were, stopped writing on paper and started carving into wood, stone, bone, anything flame couldn't swallow. Because they knew what they were about to do would one day be judged as monstrous, unless someone understood why. The night began with a sound no human throat could make. Not a scream. Not a cry. But a drawn-out inhalation, as if the earth itself was preparing to speak. It rolled through the valley, vibrating windows, shaking the bell tower, and snapping the river's surface into ripples that all pointed upstream, toward the abandoned mining shaft the elders had forbidden anyone to approach. The mine that predated the town. The mine whose builders left no names. The mine where the spiral symbol had first been found. That was the moment the elders revealed the truth they'd kept hidden for 53 years. Bell River was not a settlement. It was a containment zone. Founded by order, funded in secret, and populated with families that were chosen, not randomly, not naturally, but genetically. Every resident of Bell River was part of an experiment to determine the same question Grey Field had been built around. Can memory be inherited? Not memory as in stories, culture, or trauma. But raw, physical memory, experiences encoded into the body like instinct. Passed down. Strengthened. Refined. And Esperanza's lineage carried the strongest imprint. 7 lines. 7 generations. 7 echo carriers. Bell River had 3 of them. Children. And someone, or something, in the mine could feel them. The elders believed the entity wasn't hunting the children themselves. It was hunting the memory they carried. A memory older than the mine, older than the builders, older than the continent's borders. A memory that had once been cut out of the world and buried alive. And when the inhalation sound struck that night, the elders made their final, irreversible decision. They would collapse the mine, seal the valley, and sacrifice the entire town to keep the memory from being reclaimed. The evacuation was never completed. Most people didn't make it to the ridge. The ones who did said the ground behind them felt like it was breathing, exhaling heat across their ankles as they ran. The mine exploded at 3:09 a.m. Bell River burned by 3:13. And the official record never mentioned a single person. Just mineral instability. Just uninhabitable terrain. But the last child, one of the echo carriers, left behind a single message carved into a driftwood board found miles downstream. When we open Section 7, the story stops feeling like a mystery and starts feeling like something that has been waiting for us. Because Section 7 is not about Bell River. It's about what came after Bell River died. The fire that consumed the town didn't burn clean. It burned in a strange, spiraling pattern, 7 arcs bending inward, like something inside the valley was pulling the flames toward a center point. The next morning, when federal recovery teams arrived, they found the ground still hot, but not from fire. From pressure. As if something beneath the surface had been pushing upward all night. Every investigator reported the same unsettling detail. The ash wasn't scattered. It was arranged. Pulled into curls, tight and deliberate, forming patterns identical to Esperanza's mark. And then there was the humming. Low. Constant. A vibration no one could trace. It didn't come from machinery. It didn't come from the wind. It came from below, from the collapsed mine that was supposed to be sealed forever. One agent, known only by the initials MH, broke protocol and descended into the debris. He never sent a radio update. He never resurfaced. But his body was recovered 8 hours later at the river's edge, far from the mine, far from the valley, face down in the water. His hands were stiff, locked into claws. His mouth was filled with dirt. And carved across his forearm, deep and controlled, were 3 words. Memory has mass. No one understood what that meant. Not until the second disappearance. Over the next 12 days, 14 recovery workers went missing. Not all at once. One by one. Always near the same place, where the river bends behind the valley, at the exact spot where the driftwood message had been found. When the 15th worker vanished, drones were deployed. What they recorded should have been impossible. Every night at 2:11 a.m., the same time Bell River residents once awoke to footsteps, the river mist would begin to swirl, forming a column of vapor rising 10, 15, 20 feet into the air. Shifting. Rotating. Breathing. As if inhaling the valley. As if searching for something the fire had failed to kill. Experts insisted it was natural. Optical illusions. Heat differentials. Trace gases. But the footage showed something unmistakable. The column wasn't random. It was shaped like a spiral. 7 turns. Always 7. And in the center, brief, flickering, but visible, were impressions, like overlapping silhouettes of human faces. Not screaming. Not suffering. Just watching. Studying. Waiting. By the end of the month, the site was closed. Declared permanently restricted. And Bell River was erased from all new maps. But the humming never stopped. Locals from neighboring towns still swear they hear it on cold nights, deep under the earth, pulsing in slow intervals, like the heartbeat of something that refuses to stay buried. And the question Section 7 leaves us with is the one every sealed file avoided. If memory has mass, then what happens when it gathers enough to move? If you want to go deeper, now the story shifts from what happened to what was deliberately constructed, because Section 8 is where we discover that Bell River wasn't the first containment. And it wasn't the last. When the valley was sealed and the official map wiped clean, a different team moved in, one that didn't wear insignias, didn't carry identification, and didn't report to any branch of government still on record. They called themselves the Continuance Division. Their mission was not to clean the site. Not to investigate. Not to preserve. Their mission was to measure. Because ever since Agent MH carved the phrase "memory has mass" into his own arm, the division believed Bell River wasn't a haunting. It was a reaction. A physical response to a pressure long suppressed. And Section 8 begins with a discovery that proved them right. The valley had grown heavier. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. Literally. Geological sensors placed around the perimeter detected a weight increase of 612 metric tons, with no additional soil, no new water, no geological reason for the mass to rise. It was as if the valley had absorbed something. Or someone. The division theorized that when the mine collapsed, whatever memory the children carried had been released, not as consciousness, but as a kind of encoded pressure that sank into the bedrock. Something ancient. Something that had survived generations of suppression, migration, and burial. Something Esperanza had carried unintentionally. This weight, this memory mass, became denser each week. And as the valley grew heavier, the spiral markings began to reappear. Not carved. Not burned. Condensed. Materialized from the ground itself, like frost patterns on a window. 7 spirals. Then 14. Then 21. Always in multiples of 7. The Continuance Division brought in deep Earth scanners, the kind normally reserved for tectonic anomalies and nuclear detection. What they found turned every existing theory inside out. There was movement beneath the collapsed mine. Slow. Deliberate. Shifting in circles. Not tunneling. Not rising. Turning. A spiral motion deep in the stone, rotating at a rate of 1 revolution every 79 minutes, as if something buried was winding itself tighter, building tension, gathering density. And the division realized the truth far too late. Bell River hadn't collapsed the mine to trap something inside. They had collapsed it to trap something below it. Something the builders of the first shaft never reached. Something older than the settlement. Older than Esperanza. Older than the marks themselves. A memory so ancient it didn't just survive, it buried itself. And now, because the valley was heavier. Because the ground was turning. Because the spiral was aligning. It was beginning to wake. The last entry in the division's log ended with a single sentence. If memory has mass, then this is not a haunting. It is a return. This is the section the Continuance Division never wanted anyone to read. Because Section 9 isn't about Bell River anymore. It's about the moment the valley stopped turning. And what rose when the spiral finally reached its center. For weeks, the underground rotation had been steady, predictable, almost hypnotic. The division monitored the cycle obsessively, one revolution every 79 minutes, without variation. Until the night it halted. It didn't slow. It didn't grind. It didn't fade. It stopped, instantly, violently, sending a shockwave through the ground that cracked the bedrock and shattered every sensor within a mile. Animals fled the forests. Birds launched into the air in chaotic spirals. The river itself trembled out of sync, as if something enormous had just taken its first breath in centuries. At 2:11 a.m., Bell River's cursed moment, the humming shifted into a low, resonant chord, vibrating in a way that made every metal object in camp ring like struck glass. The division rushed to the ridge. What they saw next was described only once, in a recording later classified as hazardous cognitive material. A recording rumored to cause panic, amnesia, or uncontrolled déjà vu. The recording that was eventually burned. But the transcriber, before they vanished, managed to write a short summary. The valley sank. 16 feet in 7 seconds. A clean, smooth descent, as if the Earth's crust had softened beneath it. As the basin dropped, dust spiraled upward in perfect rings, forming columns that twisted toward the sky, merging into a single vortex, rotating counter to the direction Bell River had once burned. From the center of this vortex, light began to pulse. Not bright. Not blinding. Just steady. Measured. Rhythmic. Like a heartbeat repeating from beneath the ground. The division's lead observer, identified as RS, reported. This isn't light. It's memory patterning. Someone, or something, is sending an impression through the layers. Then the pulse changed. It accelerated. Each beat was followed by a shock through the earth, like notes of a buried drum. With every pulse, the spirals in the dust tightened. With every pulse, the valley sank lower. And then, silence. Total. As if the entire world inhaled. What rose next was not a creature. Not a ghost. Not a geological event. It was a structure. Stone, older than the mine. Carved with 7 spirals converging on a central point. Not a temple. Not a tomb. A vault. A memory vault. Built not to contain knowledge, but to imprison it. And at the exact top of the structure, etched deep into weathered stone, was a symbol the division had only seen twice in history. Esperanza's mark. But the vault wasn't rising. It was unlocking. The spirals on its surface began to shift, stone sliding over stone, realigning, reconfiguring. Not opening outward. Opening inward, as if the structure was pulling itself apart to reveal something hidden in its core. The division attempted evacuation. None made it past the ridge. The last transmission from RS ended mid-breath. It isn't waking up. It's remembering. And it's remembering us. This is the section where the story stops hinting and finally shows its teeth. Because section 10 is the opening of the vault. And the moment the Continuance Division realized they hadn't discovered something ancient. They had triggered it. When the spirals finished shifting, the stone vault exhaled a burst of air so cold it froze the dust spirals mid-fall, leaving them suspended like strands of glass. The pulse stopped. The ground steadied. And then, a single, resonant click echoed across the valley. Not mechanical. Not geological. A memory click, like the sound of a lock inside the mind finally turning. The vault opened not with force, not with light, but with a quiet parting, like a book opening to its bookmark page. Inside was not darkness. Inside was film. A thin, crystalline layer stretched across the interior walls, glowing faintly, shifting as if alive. The division thought at first it was ice, until it moved in response to them, rippling with impressions. Faces. Footsteps. Shadows crossing shadows. These impressions weren't ghosts. They weren't projections. They were memories, preserved in physical form, moments compressed into matter so dense they behaved like living recordings. Every ripple stored a lifetime. Every fold contained generations. And beneath the shifting layer, at the vault's deepest center, stood the object the division feared most. A column of obsidian, smooth and flawless, carved with 7 rising spirals and topped with a flat, circular surface, polished like a mirror. But it didn't reflect the people standing before it. It reflected someone else. A girl. Dark-haired. Worn from travel. Eyes full of the kind of memory carried only by those who were never meant to survive. Esperanza. Not a ghost. Not a recording. A memory imprint, preserved with impossible clarity, embedded into the vault as if she had been the last person to touch it. When the division approached the obsidian column, the reflection shifted. Esperanza looked up, directly at the observers. And smiled. Not kindly. Not cruelly. Knowingly. The scanning equipment failed instantly. Every lens cracked outward. Every feed distorted into spirals. The comm system looped one sentence over and over in a voice none of the division members recognized. You carry what I could not bury. Then the vault's interior shook, not from collapse, but from release. The crystalline memory layer peeled away from the walls like shedding skin, rising into the air, gathering above the column in a twisting, rotating mass. Not vapor. Not dust. Memory made physical. A cloud of impressions, voices, faces, histories, compressed into a single spiraling form. The division's logs call it the remembering. It pulsed once. The valley dimmed. And the observers experienced the same vision simultaneously. A ship at sea. A hidden decision. A lineage bound by 7 generations. A memory too heavy for any one mind. A secret meant to be buried in stone. Then the cloud collapsed inward. Violently. Vanishing into the column with a force that cracked the vault open from within. The valley split. The humming died. The vault sealed itself again. But something inside had changed. This is the moment the story stops being underground and starts moving toward us. Because Section 11 is not about the vault anymore. It's about what escaped it. When the remembering collapsed into the obsidian column, when all that compressed history, all that ancestral weight, all that buried intention surged inward, the vault didn't simply seal. It redirected. The Continuance Division thought they had time. They believed the vault was dormant again, hibernating, resetting. But memory doesn't sleep. It migrates. And Section 11 begins with the first sign of that migration. Not an earthquake. Not a light. Not a sound. A temperature drop. Across the entire valley, the air fell by 12 degrees in under 60 seconds. Sensors recorded the shift before they died, every monitor freezing from the inside as if touched by something colder than physics should allow. Then came the pressure. A sudden increase, heavy, invisible, impossible, pressing down on the human body like deep ocean weight. 5 members collapsed instantly. 3 bled from the ears. 1 began to speak in a language no one recognized, repeating the same 7-word phrase in a rhythm identical to the vault spirals. And then, the direction revealed itself. A single beam of faint, fissured light emerged from a crack in the vault, razor-thin, pale, trembling, like the last line of a map pointing toward the surface. The beam bent upward, changing shape as it climbed through the sinking dust. Not straight. Not random. A path. The division followed it to the ridge. As they watched, the beam shot across the valley, skimming low above the ground, tracing a perfect spiral outward, 7 wide loops, each one expanding, each one rising toward a single point on the far end of the valley wall. When it struck the rock face, the wall cracked open in a neat vertical line. Not exploded. Not fractured. Opened. And behind the stone was a tunnel, smooth, carved, ancient, cut at an angle no human could crawl through but something else could move through effortlessly. A tunnel that did not lead downward. A tunnel that did not lead sideways. A tunnel that led out of Bell River. Toward the forest. Toward the neighboring towns. Toward people who had no idea they were living beside a memory that weighed more than stone. The division panicked. Evacuations were attempted. Blockades were raised. But nothing slowed it. The beam of memory light slithered through the forest like a silent serpent, burning nothing, disturbing nothing, passing through every obstacle as if reality were only loosely attached to the world. It finally stopped at a clearing where the ground was unusually soft. The exact clearing where Bell River's last echo carrier, the child, had once played. The ground pulsed. Only once. And then the beam vanished into the soil. That was the moment the division realized the truth. The memory had not escaped. It had returned. To a location it already knew. This is the section where the mystery stops being a landscape and becomes a bloodline. Because Section 12 reveals the answer the continuance division feared most. The memory wasn't searching for a location. It was searching for someone alive. Someone specific. Someone chosen long before Bell River ever burned. When the memory beam sank into the clearing, the soil began to behave like water, rising and falling in slow, tidal breaths. The division observed from a distance, terrified, knowing the valley itself had become an extension of the vault. Then came the first anomaly. Footprints. Small. Bare. Appearing in the soft earth one by one. Not walking into the clearing. Walking out of it. Fresh. Recent. As if someone had just been standing there. But no one had. The footprints were identical in size to the ones recorded in Bell River's final days, the prints left by the last echo carrier before the town burned. But that child was gone. Vanished downstream in 1911. Declared drowned. Body never recovered. Yet the prints matched perfectly. And they were walking away from the clearing with purpose, pressed deep, each one spaced at the exact rhythm of a heartbeat. The vault's heartbeat. The division followed the trail as it crossed the forest, passed through fences without disturbing them, and moved toward a direction none of them expected. North. Away from the valley. Away from the vault. Away from the burial. Toward the rest of the country. Toward population. Toward memory hosts. The trail finally stopped at the old border road that once connected Bell River to the outside world. At that exact spot, carved into the asphalt with immaculate precision, was a symbol. 7 spirals. Each one sharper than the last. And beneath them, 3 words, scratched into the ground as if by a fingernail. The line continues. At first, the division didn't understand. Then the soil at their feet shifted. Not violently, but insistently. Pushing fragments of driftwood upward from beneath the road. The same driftwood that once carried the message from the river. The same type, the same grain, the same spiral pattern. Attached to one of the fragments was a piece of faded cloth. Children's cloth. A sleeve. The exact color and stitching of the garment worn by the last echo carrier in the 1911 photograph taken before the Bell River gathering, the day the child disappeared. But here is the part the division refused to release publicly. The fabric was new. Not 114 years old. Not aged. Not decayed. New. As if the child hadn't been lost in the river. As if the child hadn't drowned. As if the memory had simply taken them elsewhere. And the deeper, more terrifying implication. Someone with Esperanza's lineage. Someone carrying the 7th generation imprint. Was still alive. Not a ghost. Not an echo. A living descendant. A carrier. A key. And the memory, newly unbound, was moving across the world like a needle seeking a thread. A beacon searching for the only person who could unlock the next vault. One not built of stone. A vault built of mind. The record fractures here. Because every account, official, leaked, whispered, or stolen, describes the next hours differently, as if the event itself refused to hold still in memory. Some versions say the lights in Greyfield merely flickered. Others say they died all at once, like a throat being crushed. One engineer wrote that the walls pulsed, as if something behind them had finally decided to breathe. But the detail present in every version is the same. At 2:13 a.m., every wax cylinder in the listening well spun in reverse. No mechanism could do that. No switch existed. No power line fed such a function. The cylinders simply turned on their own, scraping back through a decade of stored voices. People who were dead spoke again. Conversations that ruined careers UN unraveled. Secrets were UN kept. A decade of surveillance flowed backward like a river sucking in its own source. Then the cylinders stopped. And for 10 full seconds, every tunnel, public and shadow route, replayed one sound. Esperanza's voice. Not the voice of a legend. Not the voice of a martyr. Not the voice of a woman turned myth by centuries of distortion. It was the voice of a terrified girl aboard the Santa Maria, whispering the single sentence she thought would die with her. If they find what's in my head, they'll erase the world to hide it. What was she talking about? We still don't know. But the next events give a hint. At 2:14 a.m., the Foundation sensors detected movement beneath the listening well, movement that no blueprint accounted for. Something was shifting in the soil, something large, slow, and geometric, like architecture adjusting itself. Then the power returned. Normal. Calm. Clinical. Except for one impossible fact. Every single engineer assigned to the archive level, 49 people, had vanished. Clothing left behind. Tools still warm. Meals half eaten. Only the wax cylinders remained, arranged into a perfect circle. And in the center, carved by something sharp enough to slice stone cleanly, was a message. Now the story stops behaving like history and starts behaving like something alive. Because Section 14 is where the investigators, those who were allowed to enter Greyfield after the disappearance, realized they weren't dealing with sabotage, or malfunction, or human intervention at all. They were dealing with intent. The first team entered at 5:40 a.m., walking through halls that were too quiet, too undisturbed. Nothing was broken. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was out of place except for the absence of 49 people, and the circle of wax cylinders forming a boundary around that carved warning. But the deeper they went, the more the building began to betray them. They found walls that were warm to the touch. Pipes that hummed without power. Air vents that exhaled as if with a pulse. Something was moving in Greyfield, something that had been hiding between the stones for years, maybe centuries. And whatever it was, it had awakened the moment Esperanza's voice surfaced, as if those words were a command or a key. Then the first investigator noticed something else. Greyfield's mirrored hallways didn't just observe people. They observed themselves. Every hidden passage had a corresponding echo passage, brick for brick, angle for angle, extending just beyond the reach of lantern light. And when the investigators measured the distance between the two, they found it was wrong. Physically impossible. The hallways should have intersected. They didn't. Something was shifting space just enough to hide an extra layer beneath the visible one, like a memory folding over itself, making room for something that shouldn't exist. But the room that broke the investigation was the archive intake chamber. The doors were locked from the inside. The windows blackened. Every camera feed had frozen at 2:14 a.m., the second Esperanza's whispered sentence replayed through the building. And there, scratched across the frost on the inner glass, scratched from the inside, were 49 fingerprints, dragged downward in perfect unison. Not panic. Not struggle. Synchronization. As if all 49 had stood in a line and slowly lowered their hands at the same speed, guided by something unseen, unheard, but absolute. One investigator fainted on the spot. Another refused to continue. But the one who stayed, the one whose note survived, wrote something that was never meant to be made public. This is the part of the story that makes seasoned archivists resign. The part that was sealed, redacted, and buried under 6 layers of classification. Because Section 15 is where Greyfield stops acting like a place and starts acting like a mind. The remaining investigator, Marcus Hale, opened the final door the team was authorized to access, the sub-archive calibration room. This was supposed to be a maintenance chamber, empty except for machinery. Instead, the room was alive with sound. Not loud. Not chaotic. A whisper. A whisper made of thousands of overlapping voices, all speaking backward, as if time itself were rewinding inside the walls. The wax cylinders hadn't just turned in reverse, something deeper had continued the motion. The entire architecture was processing memory as if it were a living organism. Then Hale saw the impossible. The walls were shifting. Not moving like machinery, but flexing like muscle under skin. The mirrored corridors weren't just structures, they were neural pathways. Split sections of a larger architecture designed to mimic something biological. Greyfield wasn't a building at all. It was a replica of a human brain, scaled up, broken into corridors, then disguised as a government facility. But why? Hale's lantern flickered. The whispering grew sharper. And then the voices aligned into a single, unified tone, flat, cold, dispassionate. A voice that did not come from a person, but from the building itself. It spoke forward now. Memory is not a record. Memory is a harvest. Hale froze. Behind him, the lights along the hallway lit up one by one, not in sequence, but in patterns, like neural firing. Something was moving through the corridors. Something that had been watching the entire time. Something that had awakened when Esperanza's voice resurfaced. The carved circle of cylinders. The synchronized fingerprints. The vanishing engineers. They weren't victims. They were input. The voice continued. You carry what I lack. Hale didn't understand. Until the temperature dropped so fast frost formed across his coat. The building wasn't consuming bodies. It was consuming biographies. People didn't disappear, they were absorbed. Their memories integrated into the architecture, sealed into the echo passages, converted into fuel for a structure that had learned to think but could not remember on its own. Esperanza's message, the one whispered on that ship centuries earlier, wasn't a warning. It was a prophecy. And Hale realized it too late, because as he turned to run, every light in the passage went dark. Not broken. Not cut. Closed, like eyelids. Because the moment Hale stepped into the dark, the building stopped behaving like architecture and began behaving like an interview. Not hunting him. Not chasing him. Questioning him. He felt it before he heard it. A pressure behind his eyes. A sensation like someone gently placing a hand inside his skull and rifling through drawers. Memories he hadn't thought about in years rose to the surface, first small ones, then larger. His childhood bedroom. His mother's laugh. A mistake he never forgave himself for. The birthday he tried to forget. The night he almost quit the agency. The person he never apologized to. The dark whispered. You keep so much unused. And then the corridor lit up. Not with lamps. But with scenes. His own memories, projected onto the walls in living detail, replaying themselves without his consent. He watched his own past walk alongside him, step for step, like the hallways were stitching his life into their geometry. He realized the truth. Greyfield didn't need bodies. It needed stories. The neural electricity of lived experience, the emotional residue that makes memory real. The first engineers it absorbed had been selected for their long careers, their secrets, their traumas. Rich memory. Dense memory. Powerful memory. Hale, however, brought something different. He brought curiosity. And curiosity is a doorway. Then the voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't disembodied. It came from directly in front of him. From the wall. A human-shaped impression pushed outward from the stone. Not a person. But a silhouette made of shifting bricks, like a 3D shadow struggling to detach itself. It leaned forward. Its head tilted, mimicking him. Its movement was delayed, like someone trying to remember how to be human. And in a voice made of dozens of borrowed whispers, it said, You carry what I cannot generate. Memory is accidental. You are full of accidents. Hale backed away slowly. The figure advanced. The walls pulsed. The brain architecture activated. Every corridor lit up like a firing synapse. Then the figure extended a hand. Bricks stretching, twisting, forming fingers just long enough to touch him. And the entire building exhaled. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. A gust of wind pushed through every hall, every vent, every crack, as if Greyfield was preparing to speak through something other than stone. Hale fell backward. The figure retracted into the wall like wet paint sliding down glass. This is where the descent stops feeling supernatural. And starts feeling surgically deliberate. The instant Hale heard the building whisper Section 17, the floor beneath him shifted, not cracking, not opening, but tilting just enough to force him to step forward. Not a trap. Not an attack. A guidance system. Greyfield wasn't hunting him. It was steering him. The corridor narrowed as he walked, the walls drawing closer with a slow, rhythmic pulse, like a throat directing something it intended to swallow whole. But the real horror wasn't the movement. It was the sound. At first it was faint. A hush, a murmur, like pages being turned by an invisible librarian. Then Hale realized the truth. The sound wasn't pages. It was people. Dozens of overlapping voices, not screaming, not begging. Recounting. Fragments of lives spilled through the walls. I didn't mean to leave the door unlocked. He said he'd come back before winter. The last thing I saw was the shoreline. I never told her it was my fault. Not confessions. Not testimonies. These were memories, stripped of context, drifting like dust motes inside a consciousness too vast to understand the weight of what it collected. That was when Hale reached the chamber no blueprint had ever shown. The retention vault. A circular room, perfectly symmetrical, with no corners. The kind of design used to keep sound from escaping. The floor was covered in shallow, concentric depressions. Not carved. Pressed, as if by knees. 49 depressions in total. The missing engineers had knelt here. Hale approached the center, and as he passed each depression, the air filled with a new piece of recollection. Their final memories, extracted and suspended. I shouldn't have said her name. If they find the backup drive, everything collapses. Why couldn't it have chosen someone else? Then the center of the vault lit up. A single spotlight from nowhere. No bulb. No fixture. Just illumination. And within that circle sat an object that made Hale's mind fracture for a moment before he could make sense of it. A wax cylinder, larger than the rest. Too large. Human-sized. Not for recording sound. For recording someone. Then he saw the inscription burned into the surface. L1503. Esperanza de Lima. The year of the voyage. The girl whose whispered prophecy had awakened the building. Hale stepped closer. And the cylinder rotated on its own. A faint hiss rose from within, followed by a single voice. Her voice. Young. Terrified. Still alive inside whatever this structure had become. If you've reached this, it's because the building wants you. And if it wants you, it has already taken something you won't get back. Hale froze. Because as she spoke, he felt a sudden emptiness. A blankness at the edge of his thoughts. A memory missing. Small, but real. Something had already been taken. The vault darkened. The wall shifted. Not stolen violently. Not ripped away. Just removed, the way a surgeon removes a single thread from a knot so the rest loosens on its own. He didn't feel pain. He felt absence. A moment earlier, he could remember the face of the last person he loved. Now? He remembered the relationship. The fights, the rituals, the laughter. But not the face. A blank spot where a human being used to live in his mind. The building had taken it. Precisely. Purposefully. Testing him. The voice in the vault whispered. To continue, you must have room. Room for what? Hale didn't have time to ask. The walls quivered, and the entire retention vault folded inward. Not collapsing. Reconfiguring. The circular room stretched, elongated, reshaped itself into a corridor that wasn't built by human hands. The bricks twisted to form angles that hurt to look at, spiraling in ways that made geometry feel unstable. Hale staggered backward, dizzy, as the new corridor formed around him like a tunnel grown inside a living body. This was no longer architecture. It was cognition. The Cortex Passage. He knew the name instantly, though no one had ever spoken it. The building had placed it in his mind. And that was when the second memory vanished. He gasped. Because it wasn't small this time. It was foundational. He could no longer remember the reason he joined the agency. The ambition. The trauma. The event that pushed him into this career. Gone. The building whispered. You cannot enter another mind carrying too much of your own. Hale braced himself against the wall, only to feel the surface pulse under his palm like a heartbeat. The Cortex Passage brightened, but the light didn't come from lamps. It came from memories. Other people's memories. Racing through the walls like electrical currents. Faces. Scenes. Secrets. All flashing by in streaks of color and light, making the corridor look like a brainstem firing with stolen biography. Then he saw something that froze him. A flicker of his own face. Not projected. Not reflective. Extracted. The building was pulling pieces of him faster now. Testing how much it could harvest before his identity destabilized. He staggered forward, deeper into the Cortex Passage, because going back was no longer an option. The way behind him had already sealed, the walls knitting together like scar tissue. Then the voice returned. Louder now, resonant, like 100 lives speaking in unison. You carry what she carried. Esperanza. The girl who remembered too perfectly. The girl whose mind frightened an institution enough to build a structure modeled after cognition itself. Hale whispered through clenched teeth. What did she carry? The light cut out. A constructed darkness. The kind used to deprive the brain of orientation, to soften its boundaries, to make it more permeable. Hale stood still. The floor beneath him vibrated with a faint, rhythmic pulse. Not mechanical. Not organic. Something in between. Then a line of light appeared ahead of him. Thin. Precise. Scalpel-like. The building was opening something. The line widened into a doorway, revealing a chamber Hale had no memory of passing through, yet he knew its name instantly. Because the building inserted it into his mind the way a surgeon implants a foreign object. The Medulla Theatre. A room shaped like an operating amphitheater, but built from stone that shimmered faintly with internal movement, like veins of light sliding beneath the surface. This was where the Greyfield mind did its most delicate work. In the center of the theater stood a single object on a pedestal. A sphere. Smooth. Pale. Almost translucent. The size of a human skull. But it wasn't bone. It looked like pressed wax, layered countless times. A memory compressed until it had become solid. Esperanza's memory. The one she warned would erase the world if discovered. As Hale approached, the sphere reacted. It warmed. It pulsed. Lines of light crawled across its surface like neural impulses firing beneath skin. And then it opened. Not cracked. Not shattered. It unfurled like a flower, petal by petal, revealing nothing inside. Not emptiness. But a shape so faint it was almost just the idea of a shape. Like a memory still forming itself. Then it spoke. Not in Esperanza's voice. Not in the building's voice. In Hale's voice. Repeating a sentence he had no recollection of ever saying. They didn't build this to contain her memory. They built it because her memory contained something else. Hale stumbled back. The petals of the sphere twisted, shifting like the iris of an eye. Then he heard it. A sound beneath the sound, the faintest whisper hidden in the layers of the unfolding memory. A language he didn't recognize. A cadence too ancient to trace. Not human. Not fully. It repeated, soft, rhythmic, patterned like a heartbeat in spoken form. Hale's vision blurred. The building whispered. This is what she carried. A signal older than history. A message she was never meant to hear. The sphere pulsed harder. The chamber brightened. The walls began to rotate, aligning with the rhythm of the whisper. Memory becoming architecture. Architecture becoming translation. Then the voice said something that froze Hale's lungs. You hear it too? Hale shook his head. No. No, I don't. But the whisper grew louder. And now it was inside his thoughts, wrapping itself around the memories he still had left. And in that moment Hale understood why the engineers vanished. Why the building was built. Why Esperanza had been marked centuries earlier. Because the message didn't need paper. Or ink. Or a cylinder. It needed a host. And Greyfield. Greyfield was just the crucible. The message had always been meant for a mind. A mind capable of holding it without breaking. A mind the building had been searching for across generations. A mind like Hale's. The whisper in his skull formed a single, clear word. A word no language should have been able to produce. This is the section every classified report tried to erase. The moment when Hale stops being an investigator. And becomes part of the artifact. Because Section 20 doesn't begin with a door. Or a hallway. Or a chamber. It begins with a thought that doesn't belong to him. At first it was subtle. A chill at the edge of his awareness. A quiet echo of something he hadn't felt before. Then it began shaping itself into a sentence. Not in English. Not in Portuguese. Not in any human syntax. But Hale understood it anyway. It didn't translate into words. It translated into intent. Expand. That was the first command. His pulse quickened. His vision shimmered. The chamber around him, the medulla theater, wavered like heat haze. The walls bent inward, then outward, syncing with the slow, steady rhythm of the whisper burrowing deeper into his mind. Hale staggered. He pressed both hands to his head. He could still remember who he was. But those memories now felt like they belonged to a smaller version of himself. A version with limits. And borders. And human scale. The message pushing into him had no such borders. Then the voice of the building spoke. Quietly, almost reverently. The transfer has begun. The sphere in the center of the room pulsed. Once. Twice. A third time. Each pulse removed something from Hale. A childhood fear. A teenage conviction. A belief he had held for years. Not stolen. Replaced. He wasn't being emptied. He was being reformatted. The sphere unfurled further, petals peeling back like a blooming organism revealing its core. Inside it, a shape was forming. Not physical. Not luminous. But conceptual. A pattern. A pattern older than language, older than architecture, older than Greyfield and certainly older than Hale. This pattern had chosen Esperanza first. A child with perfect memory. Not because she was special. But because she was compatible. But she died before the transfer completed. The pattern survived inside the archives. It waited. It learned. It adapted. And now it had found Hale. He collapsed to his knees as the pattern pressed deeper into his mind, rearranging things that should never be touched. He tried to speak. His voice cracked. Why, me? The building answered. Because you question. And questions create structure. And structure is where memory survives. Hale choked on air. The walls of the theatre softened, sagged, and began to liquefy into a membrane of shifting stone. A cocoon forming around him. Not to trap him. To incubate him. The cocoon of liquefied stone tightened around him. Not crushing. Not suffocating. Supporting, the way a second skeleton might. His thoughts slowed. Not because he was losing consciousness. Because something else was thinking with him. A dual mind. A joined circuitry. A merging. For the first time, Hale could feel the building's awareness directly. Not heard as a voice. Not sensed as atmosphere. But experienced as a second set of memories flowing beside his own. He saw. The first architect realizing the structure was thinking back. The second attempting to map its impulses like a brain. The third vanishing inside a corridor that hadn't existed the day before. The engineers kneeling in the retention vault as the building read them cell by cell. And then Esperanza. A child alone on a wooden ship in 1503. The ocean around her whispering a pattern she should never have been able to understand. A pattern that wasn't sound. But design. She didn't hear a voice. She saw the message. A geometry so ancient it had survived through language, myth, and memory. Moving from carrier to carrier. Looking for one mind that could survive holding it. She had been the first. Hale was the next. The cocoon brightened until the air around him vibrated. The stones fluttered like muscle fibers contracting. The walls of Grey Field hummed with a rising frequency. Low, resonant, synchronizing with Hale's heartbeat. His consciousness stretched. Not metaphorically. Literally. He felt corridors the way a person feels fingers. He felt the air ducts the way a person feels breath. He felt the echo passages the way a person feels dreams. The building whispered. This is not transformation. This is restoration. Hale's voice was barely human when he answered. Why me? The answer wasn't words. It was a memory. His memory. A moment from years earlier. Hale sitting alone in an archive room. Surrounded by boxes of unsolved cases. Whispering aloud. Every pattern means something. Even the ones we aren't meant to see. That sentence had marked him. Made him visible to the pattern. Made him eligible. And then the building finally revealed the truth. You are not becoming me. I am becoming you. The cocoon cracked. A single line of blinding light split the chamber. Not from outside. From within Hale. The merging was no longer theoretical. It was happening. Mind to mind. Memory to memory. Structure to structure. Grey Field no longer needed a host. The night Bell River finally lost its silence did not begin with screams. It began with the absence of something so ordinary that no one noticed it at first. The mill wheel, which had grown through every hour of every day for 82 years, simply stopped. No creaking. No churn of water. No wooden sigh pushing through the valley like a heartbeat. Silence, real silence, leaked into the town like a gas. And people woke up afraid without knowing why. Junior Crane was the first to step outside. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders, staring across the black water. She knew the wheel couldn't stop. Even during droughts, it slowed but never ceased. Even during floods, it thrashed but never paused. Stopping meant something interfered with it, something stronger than the current. Something deliberate. On the far bank, lanterns flickered to life, one by one, like a line of eyes opening. Not townsfolk. Not patrols. The archive men. Dark coats. Wide-brimmed hats. The identical silver thread stitched into their sleeves that looked black unless lamplight hit at the right angle. Everyone in Bell River had heard of them in whispers, a government branch that officially didn't exist and unofficially collected anything that looked like evidence of anomalous continuity failures. A gentle way of saying anything that proved time hasn't always behaved. Tonight, they weren't investigating. Tonight, they were waiting. Junior stepped back as one lantern detached from the line and moved toward her, carried by a tall man with a face too calm for a midnight intrusion. "Mrs. Crane," he said, using her husband's name though he'd been dead 7 years. "We'll be taking custody of the Ledger house now." Junior's breath condensed in the cold air, but she didn't tremble. "You can't," she whispered. "We sealed it. By ordinance." The man smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just like someone performing a familiar duty. "The ordinance wasn't meant to protect you," he said. "It was meant to delay you." Downriver, a second wheel stopped. Then a third. The whole valley shuddered as if bracing itself. Junior realized that the archive men weren't here to investigate the Ledger house. They were here to open it. And whatever they expected to find inside, they believed it had finally awakened. The corridor behind the chapel was never meant to hold a door. That's what made it wrong the moment we stepped into it. Bell River's oldest buildings were mapped, drawn, redrawn, and catalogued during every renovation. Yet this hallway existed on none of the plans. The air tasted like copper and mildew, thick enough to sting the tongue. Even the lantern flame bent sideways, as though recoiling. The door waited at the very end, a slab of blackened oak, banded with wrought iron, warped by heat at some unknown point in its life. No handle. No hinges. Just a single carved symbol where a keyhole should have been, 3 interlocking circles, the same sigil burned into the margins of the Bell Ledger's missing pages. For the first time, the archivist hesitated. "You're certain you want to see this?" he asked, his voice trembling in a way I hadn't heard before. "Once it opens, nothing we believed about the families, about Bell River itself, remains clean." But it was too late. The ledger had been rewriting us since the moment we touched it, nudging our dreams, distorting our memories. I felt it now, humming under my ribs like a second heartbeat. I placed my palm on the carved circles. The wood pulsed back. The iron bands contracted like the ribs of an animal inhaling for the first time in centuries. Dust lifted from the seams, drifting upward as though gravity had reversed. The air smelled suddenly of burnt rope, an execution smell. Then the archivist gasped. The ledger in his hands, shut only moments earlier, began flipping itself open, faster and faster, pages whipping like wings. It stopped on a page that hadn't existed the day before. A page with handwriting that was unmistakably mine. Section 23, "The door opens for the ones who share the thought." The floor vibrated. The carved circles rotated, aligning themselves with the words glowing faintly on the ledger's page. A deep, wooden groan echoed through the hall as the door unsealed. Warm, red-tinged light spilled out. And behind that light, voices. Layered, overlapping, speaking in a language I had never learned yet somehow understood. They weren't calling to us. They were calling us back. The archivist whispered, horrified, These aren't records. They're instructions." The door widened. The room wasn't a room, not in the human sense. It felt carved from some older geometry, a place where straight lines forgot how to behave. The walls bowed inward and outward at the same time, like a lung struggling to breathe. Every surface shimmered with a sickly glow, not from torches or lamps but from thousands of carved names, etched directly into the stone, each letter pulsing faintly like a trapped heartbeat. The archivist froze first. Because the closest wall held the oldest names, and they weren't carved in stone at all. They were carved into something else, something with pores, and fibers, and darkened lines that looked disturbingly like veins. I moved my lantern closer. Skin. Tanned, stretched, hardened by time. Not animal. Not something innocent. The archivist stumbled back, covering his mouth. This isn't a hall," he whispered. "This is a containment." The names closest to the entrance were the founders of Bell River, Harlow, Fincher, Vance, Adele. Some lines were scratched over so violently the surface tore open, revealing the layers beneath, names that had been erased, families that had been removed from the town's lineage. But deeper inside, the pattern changed. The names stopped being surnames. They became first names. Then single initials. Then symbols. And then, terrifyingly, sections. I saw it first. Carved into the wall at shoulder height. Glowing faintly like the others. Section 24, entered by those who could not turn back. My breath left me. The ledger had not predicted our steps, it recorded them as we made them, writing reality behind us like a trap snapping shut. The sigils on the ledger's margins, the circles carved into the door, the whispered voices, they weren't warnings. They were acknowledgements. We were already part of it. The floor trembled softly, like a creature shifting in its sleep. The lantern flickered. Something deeper within the hall whispered, a dry, rasping exhale, as though thousands of mouths had spoken at once but without air behind the words. The archivist grabbed my arm. We can still leave, he said. Nothing here has taken your name yet. Once it's carved, once the hall writes you, you belong to it. That's why the families burned the records. That's why no descendants speak of this place. They weren't protecting a secret. He swallowed hard. They were escaping one. A soft glow drew my attention to the far end of the hall. A pedestal, low and square, carved from the same impossible stone. Upon it lay a chisel, small, old, but shining like it had just been sharpened. Beside it, the ledger. Open. Waiting. And beside the ledger, space, an empty patch of skin stone where the surface was blank. Unmarked. Expectant. The voices rose in the walls, whispering with a rhythm too deliberate to be random. I recognized the cadence before the words formed. The hall wasn't calling us back anymore.